Black woman escorted off a plane for suspicious behavior. Turns out she's their biggest investor. How does a simple misunderstanding on a flight lead to a shocking revelation that shakes an entire industry? A calm, confident woman, unfairly labeled and humiliated, finds herself in a situation no one expected. But here's the catch. She's not just any passenger, and what happens next will leave you questioning everything. Stay with me because this story is about to uncover truths, spark change, and deliver a twist you won't see coming. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy heartwarming stories of courage and justice, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more incredible tales. Your support means the world and helps us reach even more people with these powerful stories. Now let's jump right in. The terminal buzzed with the usual hum of travelers, the click of suitcase wheels against tiled floors, and the muffled announcements of boarding calls. Helen Parker stood at the gate, her polished leather briefcase in one hand and her boarding pass in the other. Her tailored navy blazer fit her like armor, a deliberate choice, professional, understated, and commanding respect. She glanced at her watch, mentally ticking off the hours before her next meeting. The announcement for her flight crackled over the speakers and passengers began to queue. Helen walked calmly to the priority line, her heels clicking against the floor. As she approached the gate agent, she felt the subtle shift in the atmosphere, a flicker of hesitation in the agent's smile, a slight narrowing of the eyes. "Boarding pass, please," the young woman said, her tone professional but cool. Helen handed over her ticket, noticing how the agent lingered a beat too long, scanning it as though looking for an error. The woman's lips tightened before she plastered on a forced smile and handed the pass back. "Enjoy your flight," she said, her voice higher than before, the kind of pitch people reserved for politeness dipped in doubt. Helen nodded, her expression unchanging, and stepped onto the jet bridge. The first-class cabin was already filling with passengers, men in crisp suits, women with designer handbags, and a few families juggling restless toddlers. Helen found her seat near the window and placed her briefcase in the overhead bin before settling in. The seat was spacious, the leather cool against her fingertips, but Helen felt the familiar weight of being observed. Across the aisle, a middle-aged couple whispered, stealing glances at her. The man, his salt-and-pepper hair neatly combed back, leaned closer to his wife, his voice barely audible over the cabin noise. "Do you think she's in the right seat?" he murmured, just loud enough for Helen to catch. Helen's jaw tightened, but she kept her focus on her tablet, where the latest investment reports awaited her review. Numbers and projections filled the screen, a welcome distraction from the whispers and stares. A flight attendant appeared, her smile wide but unsteady. "Good evening, ma'am," she said, her eyes flicking to Helen's seat number. "Can I see your boarding pass again, just to confirm?" Helen looked up slowly, her gaze steady and calm. "I already showed it at the gate," she replied, her voice even but firm. "I understand," the attendant said, her tone overly sweet like sugar poured over vinegar. "It's just a routine check." Helen handed over the boarding pass without a word, watching as the attendant examined it with the intensity of someone searching for a counterfeit bill. After a moment, the woman nodded, her cheeks flushing. "Thank you, ma'am. Enjoy your flight." Helen retrieved her boarding pass and returned to her tablet, but the knot in her chest tightened. It was a familiar script, subtle, polite, but always the same. Doubt, suspicion, an unspoken question. "Do you belong here?" Minutes later, the cabin doors closed and the flight attendants began their safety demonstration. Helen tucked her tablet away, closing her eyes briefly to center herself. She had important work ahead, and she couldn't afford distractions. But the calm didn't last. As the plane began to taxi, Helen noticed the man across the aisle lean toward the flight attendant, gesturing toward her. His voice, though low, carried just enough. "I'm not trying to cause trouble, but don't you think it's a little odd? She's been typing non-stop, looking all serious. You know, these days you can't be too careful. Helen's chest tightened as the flight attendant glanced her way, her expression shifting from annoyance to alarm. She exchanged a look with another crew member before disappearing into the galley. Moments later, the head steward appeared, his demeanor stiff. He knelt beside Helen's seat, his voice low but firm. "Ma'am, we've had some concerns raised about your behavior. I'm going to need you to step off the plane while we investigate." Helen stared at him, her heart pounding. "Concerns? What concerns?" she asked, her voice steady despite the rush of adrenaline. "Passengers have reported suspicious activity," he said, avoiding her gaze. "It's a precaution." Helen exhaled slowly, anger simmering just beneath the surface. She stood, her movements deliberate, and retrieved her briefcase from the overhead bin. The eyes of the entire cabin followed her as she was escorted down the aisle, whispers trailing her like shadows. She stepped into the terminal, the air cooler and harsher than before. The humiliation sank in, heavy and familiar, as the door closed behind her. Helen set her briefcase down and pulled out her phone. With a calm hand, she dialed a number, her voice unwavering as she spoke. "This is Helen Parker. I need to speak with Robert Langston, now." The fluorescent lights of the terminal buzzed faintly, their cold glare illuminating the glossy floors beneath Helen's heels. She stood still, her phone pressed lightly to her ear as the dial tone rang out. Around her, the terminal seemed to exist in a different reality, indifferent to the storm swirling within her. Travelers hurried past, oblivious to the injustice that had just unfolded. Her voice, calm yet clipped, broke the silence. "This is Helen Parker," she repeated, her tone carrying an edge sharp enough to cut through the static on the other end. "Put me through to Robert Langston immediately." The pause that followed was deliberate, the kind of hesitation that often accompanied disbelief. Helen could almost picture the assistant on the other end, scrambling to process the name she had just heard. Seconds later, the voice returned, flustered and apologetic. "Yes, Miss Parker. One moment, please." Helen's eyes wandered to the window overlooking the tarmac. The plane she had been so unceremoniously removed from was still idling, its sleek body glowing under the floodlights. She watched it, a simmering frustration threading through her thoughts. How many times had she encountered this? Not this exact scenario, perhaps, but the quiet indignities, the questioning glances, the murmurs of doubt that followed her into every space she occupied. But this time was different. This time they had underestimated her. "Miss Parker!" A deep voice boomed through the phone, pulling her from her thoughts. "What an unexpected surprise. To what do I owe the pleasure?" Helen recognized Robert Langston's voice immediately. The CEO of the airline was known for his affable demeanor, but Helen also knew the steel beneath it. He was a man who valued efficiency and results, traits she herself respected. Still, there was no mistaking the tension in his tone now. "Robert," Helen began, her voice measured, "I wish this call were under different circumstances, but we need to discuss a matter that just occurred on one of your flights." A pause. She could hear the faint rustle of papers on his desk, the click of a pen being set down. "I see. I assume this is urgent." "Very," Helen replied, glancing toward the security personnel stationed near the gate. She lowered her voice, her words deliberate. "I was just escorted off flight 214. Suspicion apparently is my crime." The silence on the other end was palpable, stretching longer than she anticipated. When Robert finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that wasn't there before. "Escorted off. Helen, are you saying—" "Yes, Robert," Helen interrupted, her tone sharper now. "Your staff deemed my behavior suspicious based on the complaints of a passenger who didn't like the way I looked or the fact that I was working quietly in first class." Another pause. This one felt heavier, as though Robert was trying to gather his thoughts while grappling with the implications. Helen didn't wait for him to respond. "I need you to understand something," she continued, her voice steady but laced with an unmistakable edge. "This isn't about a misunderstanding or a simple error in judgment. This is about a culture within your airline that allows bias to dictate actions. Robert exhaled audibly. Helen, this is unacceptable. I'll take immediate action. Please give me a moment to— Not later, Helen said, cutting him off. Now. I'm standing in the terminal and I want this resolved before I leave this airport. Her words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. Robert seemed to sense there was no room for negotiation. Understood, he said finally. Where are you? I'll send a senior executive to meet you personally. Helen gave him the details, her voice calm but unwavering. As she ended the call, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The calm exterior she maintained had become second nature, a shield against moments like this. But beneath it, her frustration simmered. This wasn't just about her. It was about what her presence, her very existence, represented to people who saw her as an anomaly. Helen took a seat near the window, her briefcase resting on the chair beside her. The plane she'd been removed from was beginning to taxi now, its engines roaring faintly in the distance. She watched it go, a quiet determination taking root within her. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Minutes passed. The airport's rhythm continued around her, passengers rushing to gates, announcements crackling overhead. Helen's phone vibrated against the armrest, jolting her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. An email notification from her assistant, Grace. It was a confirmation of her next board meeting, the details neatly outlined. The email's subject line caught her attention. Parker Foundation Humanitarian Gala. A small smile tugged at the corners of her lips. The gala was her pride and joy, a culmination of her efforts to fund initiatives that uplifted marginalized communities worldwide. It was the antithesis of what she'd just experienced, a testament to her belief in change, even in the face of systemic barriers. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a sharply dressed man in a navy suit, his expression a mix of urgency and apprehension. He approached her with a slight bow of his head. Miss Parker, I'm Charles Ramsey, Senior Vice President of Operations. Mr. Langston sent me personally to address this matter. Helen gestured for him to sit, her expression unreadable. Thank you, Mr. Ramsey. I trust you've been briefed. I have, he said, his voice steady but tinged with nervousness. And let me start by offering my sincerest apologies on behalf of the airline. This is not how we conduct business nor how we treat our valued passengers. Helen tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. And yet, it happened. Charles swallowed hard, visibly thrown off by her directness. We're launching an internal investigation as we speak. The staff involved will be questioned, and appropriate action will be taken. Helen leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. Action is one thing, Mr. Ramsey. Accountability is another. I want to know exactly what steps you plan to take, not just for me, but to ensure this doesn't happen again to anyone else. Charles nodded quickly, his pen already moving across a notepad. Helen could see the sweat beating at his temple, but she didn't let up. The weight of her gaze was unrelenting. This was just the beginning. The room fell silent between them. Charles Ramsey sat across from Helen, his neatly pressed suit and polished demeanor contrasting sharply with the slight tremor in his hand as he scribbled notes. He glanced up briefly, meeting Helen's steady gaze, only to look away as if the weight of her eyes were too much to bear. Helen remained motionless, her posture regal, her face a mask of calm. Beneath the surface, her thoughts churned. She had long since mastered the art of composed confrontation, knowing that silence, when wielded correctly, could be just as powerful as words. She waited, giving Charles time to squirm. Miss Parker. Charles began hesitantly, his voice faltering slightly. I understand how this must have felt. Helen raised a hand, her fingers poised mid-air. No, she interrupted, her tone low and precise. You don't understand how it felt. You can't. But I'd like to hear how you plan to ensure it won't happen again. Charles's pen stilled, his face briefly shadowed by unease. He cleared his throat. As I mentioned, there will be an internal investigation. Those involved will be disciplined accordingly. Helen's brow arched. the smallest flicker of a frown crossing her face. Discipline is reactive, Mr. Ramsey. What about prevention? Charles hesitated, his polished corporate armor beginning to crack under the pressure. We have diversity training programs in place. I'll recommend they be revisited and improved. Helen let the silence hang between them for a moment, leaning back slightly in her chair. The pause wasn't for her benefit. It was for his, to make him feel the weight of his words, the inadequacy of a rehearsed response. Mr. Ramsey, she said finally, her voice measured and calm. I've built my career on accountability. I'm not interested in platitudes or half measures. Tell me, in concrete terms, what your airline will do to address the systemic bias that allowed this to happen. Charles shifted uncomfortably, pulling at his collar as though the fabric were suddenly too tight. Miss Parker, I'll need to speak with Mr. Langston and our board to outline specific steps, but I assure you we take this very seriously. 4. Helen leaned forward now, folding her hands on the table. And I assure you, she said, her tone soft but laced with unmistakable authority. So do I. That's why I expect to see a comprehensive action plan, one that includes policy changes, regular accountability audits, and mandatory training for all staff, not just a surface-level apology. Charles's face reddened and he nodded quickly, his pen resuming its frantic scratching. Yes, of course, I'll personally oversee the implementation. Helen studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Good, she said finally, and I trust this conversation will remain confidential, for now. Charles froze, the implication in her words hanging in the air. Of course, he stammered. Absolutely, discretion is paramount. Helen allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. I'm glad we understand each other, Mr. Ramsey. The meeting concluded, and Helen rose from her seat, smoothing the lapel of her blazer. She picked up her briefcase with deliberate slowness, her movements unhurried. She had no intention of rushing, not for them, and certainly not for the weight of the moment. Thank you for your time, Miss Parker, Charles said, standing as well. He extended his hand, his expression a mix of relief and lingering unease. Helen paused, her dark eyes locking onto his. Slowly, she extended her own hand, gripping his firmly. I'll be watching, Mr. Ramsey, she said, her voice low but deliberate. Don't let me down. With that, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the polished floor. The sound echoed in the cavernous terminal, sharp and purposeful, a reminder that she was far from finished. Outside the boardroom, Helen found herself alone in a quiet corridor. She allowed the mask of composure to slip for just a moment, inhaling deeply and exhaling slowly. Her hands clenched the handle of her briefcase tightly, a brief betrayal of the frustration and anger simmering within her. This wasn't the first time she'd encountered blatant bias, but this felt different. This time the stakes were higher, not just for her dignity, but for the precedent it could set. She couldn't walk away from this without forcing change, not when she had the power to make it happen. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. She retrieved it and glanced at the screen. It was a message from Grace, her assistant. Helen, the media is starting to catch wind of the incident. Do you want me to prepare a statement? Helen stared at the message, her mind racing. The decision loomed before her. Escalate this into a public battle or wield her influence quietly, strategically. Her instincts told her to tread carefully. Public outrage could be powerful, but so could the quiet reshaping of an institution from within. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before she began to type. Not yet. Let me handle this my way. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and began walking again, her strides measured and purposeful. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Justice wasn't just about holding individuals accountable. It was about dismantling the structures that allowed prejudice to flourish, and Helen Parker had every intention of seeing it through. Helen didn't go home that night. Instead, she sat in the corner of the private airport lounge, a quiet space where the hum of chatter was muted and the air carried the faint scent of polished wood and fresh coffee. The walls were adorned with framed photographs of smiling executives and successful flights, a carefully curated narrative of triumph. But as Helen sat there, her presence an unspoken challenge to that narrative, she felt the weight of the silence around her. The waiter who approached her table hesitated for a fraction of a second longer than necessary before placing a glass of water on the table. Helen caught the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, the same expression she had seen on too many faces that day. He opened his mouth to say something, perhaps to offer a customary, "Let me know if you need anything," but thought better of it and walked away instead. Helen let out a slow breath, her fingers tracing the rim of the glass. Her phone buzzed again, this time a call. She glanced at the screen. It was Robert Langston. She picked up, her tone neutral. "Robert." "Helen," Robert began, his voice tight as though he were speaking through clenched teeth. "I've just been briefed on the details of what happened today." "And?" Helen's response was cool, measured. She already knew where this was going. Robert hesitated, and Helen could almost hear him weighing his words, trying to craft a response that would satisfy her without admitting too much liability. "I want to personally apologize for what you experienced. It's unacceptable, and I've already started taking steps to address the issue." Helen leaned back in her chair, her grip on the phone tightening. "Steps," she repeated, her voice sharp. "Tell me, Robert, what do steps look like? A few emails? A meeting with the HR department? Firing a scapegoat while the system remains intact?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Robert spoke again, his tone was quieter, more cautious. "Helen, you know this isn't something that can be fixed overnight. I'm committed to making changes, but I need time." Helen's eyes narrowed. "Time isn't the issue, Robert. Intent is. If I hadn't been Helen Parker, the investor who keeps your airline afloat, would you even be having this conversation with me right now? Or would you be spinning a PR story to sweep it under the rug?" Robert sighed heavily. "That's not fair." "What's not fair," Helen cut him off, her voice rising slightly, "is the humiliation I endured because of the culture you've allowed to thrive in your company. The culture that emboldened your staff to treat me like a criminal for the crime of existing." The words hung in the air, sharp and unrelenting. Robert didn't respond immediately, and Helen could picture him in his office, pacing behind his polished desk, his carefully constructed image of control beginning to fray. "Helen," he said finally, his voice strained, "you have my word that this will be addressed. I just need you to trust me." Helen's lips curled into a bitter smile. Trust. That word carried too much weight, too many broken promises tied to it. "Trust," she echoed, her tone icy. "That's not something I give freely, Robert. Not anymore." She ended the call without waiting for his response and set the phone down on the table. The frustration simmered beneath her calm exterior, threatening to spill over. But Helen didn't let it. Instead, she picked up her glass of water, taking a slow sip as she stared out the lounge window. The runway lights stretched into the distance, their glow a stark contrast to the shadows lingering in her thoughts. Hours passed, and the lounge emptied as the last flights of the evening departed. Helen remained seated, her posture unwavering, her mind a battlefield of emotions. She replayed the events of the day in her head, dissecting every interaction, every insult disguised as protocol. She thought of the flight attendant's forced smile, the passengers' pointed whispers, the steward's condescending tone. And then, she thought of the little girl who had watched her being escorted off the plane, her innocent question cutting deeper than any insult. Why are they taking her away? That question lingered, a haunting reminder of the stakes at play. This wasn't just about Helen. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong, who had been told in 1,000 subtle ways that they were out of place. Helen's phone buzzed again, jolting her from her thoughts. This time, it was a message from Grace. "Helen, I've compiled the full report on the airline's incidents over the past 3 years. Sending it to you now. It's worse than we thought." Helen opened the attachment, her eyes scanning the document with a practiced efficiency. It detailed complaints filed against the airline, stories of passengers who had been mistreated, ignored, or singled out for reasons that had nothing to do with policy and everything to do with prejudice. There were patterns, recurring names among the staff, and a glaring absence of accountability. As Helen read, her frustration deepened into something sharper: resolve. By the time the first rays of dawn began to filter through the lounge windows, Helen had a plan. She rose from her seat, her movements deliberate, and gathered her belongings. Her heels echoed against the empty terminal as she walked toward the exit, her steps heavy with purpose. This wasn't just about an apology or a single conversation with the CEO. It was about dismantling a system that allowed these injustices to flourish, and Helen Parker was ready to do whatever it took to see it through. She didn't look back as she left the airport. There was no need. Her focus was fixed firmly on the road ahead, and she wasn't stopping until the entire world knew exactly who she was and what she stood for. The rhythmic hum of the elevator was the only sound as Helen ascended to the top floor of the glass-walled skyscraper. It was early morning, and the city skyline stretched out before her, bathed in soft golden light. She was headed to the airline's headquarters, her presence unannounced, her purpose deliberate. In her hands, she carried the folder Grace had compiled, its damning contents neatly tabbed and ready for presentation. Helen's reflection in the elevator doors was calm and composed, but beneath the surface a storm brewed. Her lips pressed into a firm line, her fingers tightened around the folder's edge. This wasn't just another meeting. This was the beginning of a reckoning. When the elevator doors slid open, Helen stepped into the executive lobby. The receptionist looked up, startled by her sudden appearance. Her polished demeanor faltered momentarily before she stood, smoothing her skirt. "Good morning, ma'am. Do you have an appointment?" Helen offered a faint smile, the kind that was both polite and unyielding. "I don't, but I'm sure Mr. Langston will make time for me. Tell him Helen Parker is here." The receptionist hesitated, her gaze flickering between Helen and the phone on her desk. She seemed to weigh her options before picking up the receiver. "Please have a seat," she said, her voice overly bright. "I'll let him know you've arrived." Helen didn't sit. Instead, she moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows that lined the lobby, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. She gazed out at the bustling city below, her mind focused on the task ahead. This wasn't about making a scene. It was about making an impact. Minutes later, the heavy oak doors to the boardroom swung open, and Robert Langston stepped out, his face carefully neutral. His tailored suit was impeccable, his demeanor polished, but Helen noticed the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his hand lingered on the doorframe a moment too long. "Helen," he greeted, his voice warm but cautious. "I wasn't expecting you this morning." "I'm sure you weren't," Helen replied, stepping forward. "But we need to talk." Robert gestured for her to enter the boardroom, his movements slower than usual. Helen stepped inside, taking in the room's opulence, the long mahogany table, the leather chairs, the discreetly placed decanters of water. It was a space designed to exude power and control. But today, Helen intended to take both. She placed the folder on the table and took a seat at the head, a deliberate choice that didn't go unnoticed by Robert. He sat across from her, his expression guarded. "I assume this is about yesterday," he began, leaning forward slightly. "As I said, we're already investigating." "It's not just about yesterday, Robert," Helen interrupted, her tone sharp. She opened the folder and slid a document across the table. "This is a pattern, a systemic issue that's been allowed to fester under your leadership." Robert glanced at the document, his brows furrowing as he read. "What is this?" he asked, though the answer was clear. 3 years of complaints filed against your airline," Helen said, her voice steady. "Discrimination, mistreatment, profiling, instances that were brushed aside or swept under the rug. These aren't isolated incidents, Robert. They're part of a culture you've allowed to thrive." Robert's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "I'm aware we've had issues," he said carefully. "But you have to understand we're a large organization. These things, These things, Helen interrupted again, her voice rising slightly, are not growing pains or isolated events. They are systemic failures, and yesterday I became another one of your failures. The weight of her words settled heavily in the room. Robert leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping the armrest as he processed what she'd said. "What do you want, Helen?" he asked finally, his tone resigned. "An apology? A press release? Name your terms." Helen's eyes narrowed, the steel in her gaze unrelenting. "What I want is change. Real, measurable change. That starts with accountability." Robert sighed, rubbing his temple. "I'm listening." For the next hour, Helen laid out her demands with the precision of a seasoned negotiator. She called for an independent audit of the airline's policies and practices, mandatory sensitivity and bias training for all employees, and the establishment of a passenger advocacy committee to address grievances in real time. She didn't stop there. She demanded transparency, regular progress reports, and the firing of key staff members responsible for perpetuating discriminatory practices. As she spoke, Robert listened, his initial resistance giving way to reluctant agreement. He knew Helen wasn't just any investor. Her influence carried weight, and her presence in the boardroom was a reminder of the power she wielded. When she finished, the room fell silent. Robert leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "You're asking for a complete overhaul," he said, his voice low. "I'm asking for what's right," Helen replied. "If that feels like an overhaul, maybe it's time to reevaluate what you consider acceptable." Her words hung in the air, unflinching. Robert met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something resembling respect in his eyes. "All right," he said finally, his tone firm. "You have my commitment. We'll do this your way." Helen nodded, the smallest hint of a smile tugging at her lips. "Good, I'll be watching." As she rose to leave, Robert stood as well, extending a hand. Helen hesitated for a moment before shaking it, her grip firm. "This isn't just about me, Robert," she said quietly. "It's about every person who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong. Don't forget that." With that, she turned and walked out of the boardroom, her head held high. The storm brewing within her had not passed, but for the first time, she felt the winds beginning to shift. Justice was not a destination. It was a journey, and Helen Parker was just getting started. Helen stepped out of the boardroom and into the hushed stillness of the executive lobby. The receptionist glanced up nervously, as though unsure whether to offer a polite farewell or stay silent. Helen didn't acknowledge her, her thoughts too heavy to be interrupted by pleasantries. The polished marble floor reflected the faint glint of sunlight streaming through the glass facade, but it did little to lighten the weight pressing on Helen's chest. Outside, the morning was brisk. A light breeze carried the scent of freshly brewed coffee from a nearby cafe, mingling with the faint hum of traffic. Helen paused for a moment, closing her eyes and drawing in a deep breath. The city buzzed around her, indifferent to the battle she had just fought. She clutched the handle of her briefcase tightly, her knuckles whitening, before stepping into her waiting car. "Where to, Miss Parker?" the driver asked, his voice polite but hesitant, sensing her tension. Helen glanced at her phone, which was already lighting up with new messages. Grace's name appeared at the top of the list, followed by a flurry of notifications from board members, colleagues, and journalists who had caught wind of the incident. She let out a slow sigh. The fight was far from over. "Home," she said quietly. "For now." The drive back to her townhouse was quiet, the usual city noise muffled by the car's insulated interior. Helen stared out the window, her reflection overlapping with the blur of skyscrapers and pedestrians rushing past. Her mind replayed the meeting with Robert Langston in vivid detail. His initial resistance, the flicker of realization in his eyes, and the begrudging respect that had settled in by the end. It had been a small victory, but the battle ahead loomed large. When the car pulled up to her townhouse, Helen stepped out, her heels clicking against the cobblestone driveway. She climbed the steps to her front door, each step deliberate, and unlocked it with a practiced motion. The familiar warmth of her home enveloped her as she entered, but the comfort she usually felt was absent. Her mind was still tethered to the events of the day, the gravity of her mission weighing heavily on her shoulders. Helen placed her briefcase on the dining table and sank into a chair, letting her posture relax for the first time in hours. She reached for her phone, scrolling through the messages that had piled up. Grace had sent several updates, including an offer to draft a press release detailing Helen's demands and the airline's commitment to change. Helen hesitated, her finger hovering over the screen. A public statement could amplify her efforts, but it could also invite scrutiny and backlash she wasn't ready to face. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Frowning, she rose and walked to the entryway. Through the peephole, she saw a young woman with a notebook clutched to her chest and a press badge hanging around her neck. Helen's lips tightened as she opened the door a crack. "Yes," she said, her voice cool but not unkind. "Miss Parker, I'm Mia Johnson from the Globe. I was hoping to get a comment on your experience with Skyline Airways. It's already making waves online, and I think your perspective could really—" Helen raised a hand to stop her. "I appreciate your interest, Miss Johnson, but I'm not giving interviews at this time." The journalist hesitated, her enthusiasm dimming slightly. "I understand," she said, "but if you change your mind, here's my card. I think your story could inspire a lot of people." Helen took the card without a word and closed the door softly. She leaned against it for a moment, the faint click of the latch grounding her in the present. The idea of her story becoming a public spectacle didn't sit well with her. She had fought too hard for her privacy, her autonomy. This wasn't about headlines or viral moments. It was about creating real, lasting change. That evening, as the city lights began to twinkle outside her window, Helen sat in her study, surrounded by the quiet hum of her thoughts. The folder from Grace lay open on the desk, its contents spread out before her. The complaints detailed in the report painted a grim picture. Passengers of color denied service, staff dismissing grievances, and patterns of behavior that spoke to a culture steeped in bias. Helen's gaze fell on one particular complaint, filed by a young black woman who had been removed from a flight under nearly identical circumstances to Helen's own. The woman's words leapt off the page, raw and full of pain. "They treated me like I was less than human. All I wanted was to get home to my family." Helen felt a pang of anger and sadness. She had resources, influence, and a platform to fight back. But what about the others? The ones who couldn't call the CEO or demand meetings with senior executives? The thought ignited a fire within her, a renewed determination to see this through. She picked up her phone and dialed Grace. "Grace," she said when her assistant answered, "I need you to prepare something for me." "Of course, Helen. What do you need?" "A plan," Helen replied, her voice steady. "Not just for Skyline Airways, but for the entire industry. This isn't just their problem, it's systemic, and I'm going to make sure it changes." Grace hesitated, then said, "I'll get started right away." Helen ended the call and leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The road ahead was long, and the challenges were daunting. But for the first time that day, she felt a glimmer of hope, a quiet assurance that justice was within reach. She would not stop until every passenger, every employee, and every leader in the industry understood one simple truth: that dignity, respect, and equality were not optional. They were non-negotiable. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Helen began drafting her next move, her pen scratching against the paper with deliberate intent. The winds were shifting, and Helen Parker was ready to guide the storm. The city was silent in the early hours of the morning, a calm before the bustle of a new day. Helen sat at her desk, her hand poised over a blank sheet of paper. Her laptop sat open beside her, its soft glow casting faint shadows across the room. The world outside her townhouse was still, but Helen's thoughts were anything but. Her hand trembled slightly as she began to write, the pen gliding over the paper with deliberate strokes. Each word felt heavy, burdened with the weight of what she'd endured, and the responsibility she now carried. This wasn't just about her fight. It was about standing for all the others who had been silenced, dismissed, and humiliated. She paused, staring at the words she'd written. A single act of bias ripples through lives, shaping futures, breaking spirits. And yet the power to stop it lies within the hands of those who dare to speak up. Helen leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes. Her mind drifted to the past, to memories she had buried but never forgotten. She saw herself as a young woman, fresh out of college, standing in front of a corporate boardroom for the first time. The skepticism in their eyes, the condescending smiles. They had spoken volumes without saying a word. She remembered the first time she had been called intimidating for simply voicing her ideas in a meeting. The words had stung, but she had swallowed the pain, forcing herself to smile through it. Back then, she thought that if she worked hard enough, excelled enough, and made herself indispensable, the world would finally see her for who she was, rather than what they assumed her to be. But the world hadn't changed. Not fast enough, not deeply enough. Even now, decades later, she was still fighting the same battles, albeit on a different scale. The incident on the plane had been a reminder of how far society still had to go. Her phone buzzed on the desk, breaking her reverie. She glanced at the screen. A message from Grace. Drafted an outline for the industry-wide plan. Send it to your email for review. Let me know what you think. Helen opened her laptop and clicked on the email, her eyes scanning the document with a practiced efficiency. Grace had outlined key initiatives, mandatory bias training, independent oversight committees, and passenger advocacy programs. It was thorough, well-structured, and ambitious. But Helen knew it would take more than ambition to turn this into reality. The sun began to rise as Helen finished reviewing the document, the first light of dawn spilling through the window. She set her laptop aside and stood, stretching her arms above her head. Her body ached from the tension of the past few days, but she ignored it. There was too much at stake to dwell on physical discomfort. She walked to the window, her gaze fixed on the city below. Cars were beginning to fill the streets, their headlights cutting through the morning haze. Helen watched them, her mind turning over the challenges ahead. She thought about the resistance she would face, the dismissive comments, the attempts to undermine her efforts. It wasn't a question of if those obstacles would arise. It was a question of when. And yet she felt no fear. The fire within her burned too brightly for fear to take root. She had fought too long and too hard to let anything stop her now. By mid-morning, Helen was back in the heart of the city, this time in a towering conference building. The walls of the meeting room were lined with glass, offering a panoramic view of the bustling streets below. Around the table sat key stakeholders from Skyline Airways, executives, legal counsel, and PR representatives, their expressions ranging from anxious to guarded. Robert Langston entered last, his usual air of control slightly frayed. He nodded at Helen as he took his seat, his face betraying a mix of respect and unease. "Thank you for joining us, Helen," he began, his tone formal. "We've reviewed your initial demands and are prepared to discuss how we can move forward." Helen placed her briefcase on the table, opening it with deliberate slowness. She retrieved the folder Grace had prepared, placing it in front of her. "Before we begin," she said, her voice steady, "I'd like to make one thing clear. This isn't a negotiation. It's an opportunity for your company to show the world that it values integrity over complacency." Robert's brow furrowed, but he nodded. "Understood." Helen began to outline her vision, her voice unwavering as she detailed each initiative. The room was silent, the weight of her words settling over the table like a heavy fog. She spoke not just as an investor, but as a woman who had lived the consequences of the airline's failings. Her passion was tempered by precision, each point backed by data, each demand framed as both a moral imperative and a business necessity. As she finished, the room erupted into quiet murmurs. Some executives exchanged uneasy glances, while others nodded in agreement. Robert leaned forward, his fingers steepled. "This is ambitious," he said carefully. but it's also necessary. Helen met his gaze, her expression unyielding. Ambition is what this company needs, Robert. The question is whether you're willing to embrace it. The meeting stretched on for hours, the discussions alternating between cooperation and resistance. Helen remained composed, her presence a steady anchor in the storm of debate. By the time the meeting adjourned, progress had been made, but the battle was far from over. As Helen left the building, she felt the first stirrings of hope. Change was never easy, but it was possible, and she would see it through, one meeting, one policy, one victory at a time. The fight was just beginning. The weight of the morning's meeting lingered as Helen stepped outside the towering conference building. The crisp air was a relief against her skin, still warm from the tension in the boardroom. She paused at the edge of the sidewalk, watching the flow of traffic and pedestrians, each caught in their own rhythm, oblivious to the seismic shift she was trying to create. Helen's phone vibrated in her hand, drawing her attention. It was a message from Grace. Just heard back from the advocacy group. They want to partner with us on the industry-wide initiative. Also, media inquiries are growing. Do you want to go public now or wait? Helen stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. She had spent so much of her life fighting in silence, pushing through obstacles with sheer willpower, that the idea of opening this fight to the world felt both empowering and daunting. But she knew the power of visibility, the strength that came from turning a personal struggle into a collective call to action. She typed back quickly. Let's draft the statement. But it needs to be clear. This isn't just about Skyline Airways. This is about changing the industry. She slipped the phone back into her bag and hailed a cab. The day was far from over, and there were more battles to fight. By the time Helen returned to her townhouse, the weight of exhaustion began to settle over her. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting the city in warm, golden hues. She stepped inside, the familiar quiet of her home welcoming her. For a moment, she stood in the entryway, letting the silence wrap around her like a balm. Her briefcase felt heavier than usual as she carried it to her study. She placed it on the desk, her fingers brushing against the leather as she opened it. Inside was the folder she had presented at the meeting, its contents marked with notes and revisions. She set it aside, reaching for the draft statement Grace had sent to her email. Helen read it slowly, her eyes scanning every line. The words were measured and precise, carrying the weight of her experience but framed in a way that demanded change without inviting pity. It was exactly what she needed. She made a few small edits and sent it back with a single note. Let's go live. That evening, as Helen sat on her couch, her phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. The statement had gone viral within hours, drawing attention from major news outlets and social media. The headline on one article read, "Investor Helen Parker calls for airline industry overhaul after discriminatory incident." Another read, "From victim to advocate, Helen Parker's fight for change." The public response was overwhelming. Messages of support poured in from around the world, passengers sharing their own stories, advocacy groups offering their resources, and even executives from other airlines reaching out to discuss her proposals. But not all the reactions were positive. Critics emerged, accusing Helen of using her influence unfairly or exaggerating the problem. Helen read each comment carefully, her emotions a mix of validation and resolve. Change was never easy, and resistance was inevitable. But she had ignited a conversation that couldn't be ignored, and that was a victory in itself. The next day, Helen stood before a packed auditorium at a press conference organized by Skyline Airways. Cameras flashed and reporters leaned forward, their pens poised to capture every word. Beside her stood Robert Langston, his expression a careful balance of humility and determination. "Today," Robert began, "we acknowledge not only the mistakes of the past but the need for a better future. Skyline Airways is committed to implementing the initiatives outlined by Ms. Parker, and we invite the industry to join us in this transformation." Helen stepped forward, the room falling silent. She took a moment to gather her thoughts, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. "This isn't about one airline," she said, her voice steady and clear. "This is about an industry, a system, a culture that has failed too many people for far too long. It's about ensuring that every person, regardless of who they are or where they come from, is treated with dignity and respect." Her words hung in the air, heavy with purpose. For a moment the room was completely silent. Then a ripple of applause began, growing louder until it filled the space. Helen stood firm, letting the sound wash over her. This wasn't the end of the fight, but it was a powerful beginning. That night, as Helen sat in her study, the weight she had carried for so long felt lighter. The folder on her desk was no longer a symbol of frustration, but a testament to what could be achieved when one refused to back down. She opened her laptop and began drafting the next steps, partnering with advocacy groups, setting up a watchdog organization, and pushing for industry-wide standards. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the dark sky, each one a small beacon of hope. Helen stared out the window, her reflection merging with the view. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. And for the first time in a long time, she felt the winds of change at her back. This story is a powerful reminder that standing up for what's right can create ripples of change far beyond ourselves. It's about resilience, accountability, and the courage to challenge injustice at every turn. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications, so you can join us for more stories that shine a light on the moments that truly matter.